great to be with you guys this morning. It's good to be here. It would be great if you were here with us, but I'm going to imagine again that I'm in your lounge rooms. And I hope you've enjoyed the series so far. We're 11 weeks into the first letter to the Corinthians that Paul wrote. And I've really enjoyed this letter. I think the last few weeks, and if you're still with us after those last few weeks, you deserve a medal because this has been tough going. This book addresses some big issues in the lives of believers, and it's very relevant to us. So the Corinthian church, as we've seen, was a church in the 1st century AD, obviously, and this was a church with problems. It was a problem church because it was in a problem city. It had come out of a problem culture. And so Paul the Apostle was bringing correction to the church, and he was trying to get the world out of it. It's easy enough to get the world into the church. It's a whole different ball game to try and get the world out of the church. And so Paul was trying to do that. And so that's why it's been tough going. He would have been addressing some big issues. But what I'm going to do this morning, as you can see perhaps by the title of the talk, is I want to talk about this idea of having a magnificent obsession. Now, the reason for the title will become clearer as we go through the talk this morning, but I want to suggest this morning, obviously, that we have, as believers, a magnificent obsession. And it's Jesus and the works of Christ, but that will unfold as we go through. So last week, we looked at 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, and this week we're filling in that verse 9 gap. So it's kind of a gospel sandwich in some respect. And so this is a letter in which the previous two chapters, or 8 and 10, the Apostle Paul addressed issues relating to adultery, to idolatry. He'd done that previously. So there's two areas. Firstly, in chapter 8, Paul looked at food sacrificed to idols. So how that relates to us? Well, if food sacrificed to idols directly affects us because it speaks to the way we relate to serving someone else's obsession. You see, we're not even meant to serve someone else's obsession because we can make that into idolatry. And then chapter 10, he directly speaks to making an idol out of anything that isn't Christ. So any obsession that we make that isn't Jesus. So it's really important this morning that we fill in that gap and try and join those two things up. And so 1 Corinthians 9 is a chapter in which Paul now asks the church in Corinth a series of rhetorical questions that then leads to the guts of what he's talking about. And we're going to try and get to that in just a second. So if you have your Bibles, if you have anything other than the NIV and you want to refer to that, or if you don't trust the text that I have, then please feel free to pull out your Bibles and follow along with me. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 from verse 1. And here are the questions. Paul says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. And then in verse 4, don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? And he's referring to Peter the apostle there. Verse 6, or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? So at first glance, you read these first few verses in 1 Corinthians 9 and you think, well, Paul's just having a massive pity party. This sounds like a whinge. He's just kind of laying it out there and looking for a bit of pity, but there's more to it. We should know better than that, and obviously that's not the case. And so what the background to this is that Paul's authority had been challenged by some people in the church. And these guys claimed that the Apostle Peter was their guru. So he had a following. Peter had a following. And Paul, in their opinion, wasn't really a bona fide apostle. So in other words, he wasn't part of the initial 12. He was kind of a lesser apostle. And so Paul you've got to kind of get in his head here a little bit. Paul, like all other leaders, like every leader that's ever breathed air, and that's probably going to include most of us, was being undermined by a very small group of people with an agenda to disrupt and distract his calling in the Lord. Hello, leaders, I want you to listen to me loud and clear. If you are leading anything in Christ, there will always be people that seek to undermine you. And they will always be a minority, but they'll have the biggest voice. And as a leader, you won't be able to stop from having your mind filled with the things that they talk about. That's just human nature. And so as you get more mature as a leader, you start to filter out the noise. And this is what Paul was doing. If you're a leader and this kind of thing hasn't happened to you, I want to suggest this morning that you haven't been a leader for very long, because this is just the way it goes. And so in chapter 9, Paul speaks about his calling, and he also refers to his motivation for ministry. And these are the important things that keep leaders going. And the first point I want to raise this morning is that if you are a leader, you're going to have to learn to serve without recognition, because that's what we do. Not only that, but if you're a Christian, you sign up for obscurity. There's no fame and fortune in this thing. The call to ministry and the call to being a Christian is not a privileged life. It's a call to obscurity. In fact, the most important calling in the life of a Christian is the call to follow Jesus. And when we come to Christ, we are called to follow him for all the days of our life. There's no get-out clause in this thing. This calling is the best and the worst thing that will ever happen to you. Let me say up front that the best does outweigh the worst, so don't be too put off by it. You see, the worst of ministry is temporal. It only happens here. It doesn't go to the next world. It won't last into eternity, but it might bring enmity between you and others, including your family, your friends, your work colleagues, and friends who you would otherwise value their affirmation. Don't look for it. The moment you become a Christian, you give up your rights to those things. You see, I often feel guilty because we paint a pretty tough picture of the gospel. But you see, we can make it easy for people to come to Jesus and they learn the hard stuff later, or we can tell you everything up front. And I've got a bit of a propensity towards the latter. And so this church in this church that Paul planted in Corinth and nurtured contained a very small group of people who were more than indifferent towards Paul. And guys, this is the nature of ministry. This is simply how it goes. Do you still feel called? Anyone out there feel called to ministry? Anyone in those lounge rooms, do you feel called to serve Jesus and lead? Hopefully after this you still do. But Paul went on to say there are certain rights that you possibly would expect as an apostle, and particularly as Paul with a capital A apostle. And those rights that you might expect would be the right to food and drink, would be the right to having a believing wife, and it's important that those two words go together. That he had the right to financial support from the church as well. So Paul stated these things. And like a good evangelical, he then went on to verify the statements that he made by referring to the law in the scripture. And we pick that up in verse 7. He says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat of its grapes? So he's referring to being paid for his ministry. Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk? Do I say this merely from a human point of view? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Verse 10, surely he says this for us, doesn't he? And again, it's a rhetorical question. Yes, this was written for us, because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, isn't it too much if we reap the material harvest from you? Verse 12, If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. And then verse 13, we're coming in for landing on this verse, on this passage. Verse 13, don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. So Paul here states those things that you would expect to be the right of anyone who works for anybody. And then he goes on, and this is the catch. This is the thing that really cuts a lot of people out of ministry. The second part of it here is that ministry, my friends, is a calling and a privilege. And this is where Paul's leading to. So the point of Paul's rant is revealed in this next section. And he has had a rant. He's really spewed. He's had a go at everybody. He's stated what his rights are. And then he goes on to give us the context of it in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 15. So let's pick that up. Verse 15. But I have not used any of these rights. So he states right there, I have not used those rights. And I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. I love that statement. Isn't that awesome? Verse 16, yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach. So Paul's saying here, if you are called to ministry, there's nothing else you can do. If you are called to Jesus as a believer, there's no one else you can follow. This is where we start to talk about a magnificent obsession. Verse 17, if I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make use of my rights in preaching it. You see, you may not have realized up until now that when you became a believer, your rights got flushed. From that point, you don't have rights. All of a sudden, life is a privileged thing. We step into the privilege of following Jesus. I've got to say, guys, and I am paid to preach the gospel, and I'm so appreciative of that. But you know what? Deb and I started doing this thing way beyond there was money, before there was money to be able to do that. We preached, as many of you do, and we serve Jesus because there's nothing else we could do. The call to follow Jesus is not a call to paid ministry. Paul worked as a tent maker. He had to support himself. He did this. He worked to live. He didn't live to work. I love that statement. It's a statement that Generation X introduced to the world. But Paul worked so that he could live. He worked so that he could preach the gospel. He didn't preach the gospel so that he could be paid. That's a very different way of thinking about it. So when you're called to ministry, my friends, you're not called to paid ministry. You're called to ministry full stop. And at some point, if it turns out that you get paid to do what you're passionate about, how good is that? But at the end of the day, ministry isn't a job, it's an obsession. The Christian life isn't a vocation, it's an obsession. And when an obsession takes hold of you, there's nothing else you can do. Now, I know that word obsession has negative connotations, but I want you to bear with me in this. It's no coincidence that in this chapter, this part of the chapter is wedged between two chapters that talk about obsessions. And we've already mentioned these. They both relate to idolatry. Chapter 8, food sacrifice to idols, serving someone else's obsession. Chapter 9, idolatry, making an idol out of your own obsession. And then chapter 9, wedged right in the middle of it, the only obsession that we are permitted to have, I believe, is that of Jesus himself. And so Paul's obsession in serving Jesus is expressed in verse 16 so well, where he says, woe to me if I do not preach. You know, we have to be like that, guys. Woe to me if I do not follow Jesus. I don't want to be in this world. I don't want to live through COVID-19. I don't want to be in lockdown. I don't want to be preaching to a camera. Unless I'm doing it for Jesus. You see, when you're serving Jesus, you can do anything. You can go through anything. And we should be very unapologetic, guys, when we call people to follow Jesus, that they are going to go through stuff. But at the end of the day, that stuff disappears into obscurity in our minds when we set our mind on following Christ. When young people come to me and they tell me they think God's calling them to full-time ministry. Now, old guys like me, listen, we've got to be patient with young people. We don't want to pour water on that thing. It's so good when young people are willing to literally walk on water, to put their lives on the line. And I often respond to them by saying, you know what, if there's anything you can do, do it. If there's anything else in the world that you're passionate about and that you can do, go and do it. Because if you're not passionate about serving Jesus full time, it will kill you. It'll be the worst thing you could do. We do people no favors by promising the world to young people who express a desire to full-time Christian ministry. Now, I don't pour water on them because as you've been around as long as I have, I've been around a long time now. I'm 61, but I've been in ministry a long time. And you start to recognize when the call of God is really on people. And if they're called, they won't be able to avoid it. And so at the end of the day, you can pour as much water on the fire of God, it's not going to go out. It might even flare up. There's a thing called spontaneous combustion. I used to work in a coal mine, and what happens with coal when it's been dug up and stirred up and left to sit underneath the surface of the earth, it begins to spontaneously combust. And all of a sudden, you see smoke coming out of the ground. And then when we saw that, we used to have to call in a water truck or something like that, or someone with a big hose, and they'd come and hose the thing down. And the more water you put on the coal, the harder it burnt. Spontaneous combustion, it just keeps going. And guys, it's the same with the call to ministry. You can't put it out. If Jesus has put ministry in your heart, there's nothing else you can do. And so Jesus gave a very similar answer to an ambitious Peter. This is a theme that goes right through the New Testament. Remember Peter, after he'd confessed, Jesus, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. What a great statement, particularly in the King James. And so Peter here is obviously on a spiritual high, and he had a plan for greatness. Just he and Jesus, you and I, Lord, we're going to conquer the world. Political domination, the whole thing. And Jesus replies to him very much like a father. He says, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. And so we don't need to be apologetic. When people come for ministry, don't stroke them. Don't make it easy for them. Don't give them a big hoop to get through. Make a little tiny one where they've got to squeeze through and they've got to feel the pain of it. I'm kind of joking a little bit and exaggerating, but you get what I'm saying. You see, the privilege of ministry is a costly one. It's not what ministry will do for you. I think that's a famous statement, isn't it? It's what you can do for ministry. I think a famous president might have quoted that. You see, we're not called to greatness. We're called to obscurity. And until the church gets this, we're not going to see revival. The call to follow Jesus in any capacity necessitates losing all your rights and taking the narrow path of the kingdom. Guys, I want to say that there's no regrets when you do this. I can tell you with a totally clear conscience that when Deb and I made the decision to follow Jesus and go into ministry, and it just happened, by the way, we didn't plan that thing, we have missed out on nothing. And whatever we missed out on, I don't want anything to do with it. It's as simple as that. And so we must be unapologetic in speaking to unbelievers. This is part of the gospel, my friends. If we don't preach the gospel without preaching the full gospel, then we're just trying to trick people. We mustn't be unapologetic. We must be unapologetic, I should say, when speaking to unbelievers or seekers of Jesus. Because if they choose to follow his call, it could be lonely. You see, there's no fame, there's no fortune, there's probably no recognition, and there most definitely is no pay. And if there is, it's a miracle and it happens down the road. Some of the older folk among us online, and there's a couple in the room this morning as well, might remember a book written by Lloyd C. Douglas. It might even be before many of our time, because it was written in 1929. But the book is a great book, and it was based on Matthew 6, the first 4 verses. And the title of the book is Magnificent Obsession, which is a roundabout way of saying this is where we're landing. This is where we're finally going to end up this morning. Matthew 6, 1-4, again, this is a beautiful passage, and it says this. This is Jesus. So if you have a red letter edition, as Deb mentioned last week, download Olive Tree or one of the other online Bibles. They're great. And you can do that. So Matthew 6, verses 1-4, Jesus says, "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." That's pretty coarse. Verse 2, "So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full." That's scary stuff, you know. Because when we receive our reward in full, that means there's nothing left to be given to us. And so whatever satisfaction we got out of being seen giving, that's it. It's done. There's no reward in heaven. It's all been used. Verse 3. It goes on to say, "But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you." Guys, when you step into ministry of any kind, and I want to include in ministry your first response to Jesus, when you chose to follow him, you were enlisted for ministry. When you did that, Jesus saw, and from then on in, he became your paymaster. So whatever pay you receive from God, don't try and take it all now. Because if you receive that stuff now, there may be nothing left for later. This was a great book, The Magnificent Obsession. And it was so good that it was later written into a blockbuster movie in 1954. And some of the ladies will remember Rock Hudson, though I think he turned out not to be a ladies' man in the end. But he was nonetheless a sex symbol, and he was well known. The women loved him. But the philosophy behind the book was also partly used by another movie called Pay It Forward. And many of us have seen that one. So Pay It Forward. And again, the idea with these movies is that we receive something and we give it away without telling anybody. The idea is that good deeds received are not paid back. So you receive nothing back for the good deed here on earth. But they're given forward to a needy person into the future. So there's no chance of receiving recognition from any other person for the deed that we did. You see, that's the magnificent obsession. That's the heart of Jesus. Jesus didn't come for an earthly reward. Jesus came to have you sitting with him in heaven for eternity. And as people called by Jesus, our magnificent obsession is to serve him and to defer any rewards that come with service until we meet him face to face. That's the heart of the magnificent obsession. The safest and most effective people who serve Jesus and go on to be leaders are those who do not have the need for recognition or for fame or fortune, because they know who they serve, and that's good enough for them. That's what Paul's on about. So the first part of 1 Corinthians 9 isn't a rant in a sense of saying, poor me, look what I've missed out on. It's simply Paul saying, I'd rather not have that if it meant trading in that. And the other that is obviously serving Jesus. Because that's the privilege that we're called to. And so leaders that have that kind of thinking aren't needy. They're safe people. They're good people to be around. They're not trying to exploit you. And in Matthew 25, the parable of the talents, Jesus said to his servants, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And that's the only reward that these kinds of leaders need. And guys, this morning, I want to call you to that elite group, because it is an elite group. Being a Christian is being part of an elite family, because we're called to obscurity. We're called away from fame and fortune. It's countercultural. It goes against everything that we're taught. The way to fame in the kingdom is downwards. The smaller you get, the bigger he gets, and the larger our reward becomes in heaven. Now, I know I'm going on a little bit about that reward in heaven this morning, but that's what we signed up for ultimately. We signed up to spend our whole life with Jesus here and beyond, and that's what that's about. And so obscurity in this life leads to recognition and reward in the life to come. You know what? I think it is nice to get some recognition, and every now and then we should enjoy it when that comes. Don't just brush it off. Don't fob people off when they say, "Thank you for serving me in that particular way," or "Thank you for the words that you said," or "Thank you for the worship team did a great job this morning." But you see, it's far better if you don't receive that to receive it from Jesus in any case. So it's not a bad thing to receive recognition, but just don't go looking for it. You don't need it. We don't need those things. I want to finish off this morning by asking, what is your motivation for following Christ? You see, one of the most sought after qualities in leaders is that of self-motivation. Now, I've been involved in the past in hiring people, bringing them on staff, not just here at church, but when I worked in a secular vocation. Part of my job was to interview people and to sign them up, to bring them onto the team. And one of the best traits that we look for in people that we bring on board as a team is that they're self-motivated. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, it's the lack of need to be constantly prodded and poked and told what to do. Because if we have to constantly prod and poke and give tasks to people, then they're probably not self-motivated. And if we have to constantly give people incentives for achieving and then punishments for failing, then they're probably not self-motivated. And yet, that's how the world goes about business. And unfortunately, it's how many in the church go about business. But guys, I want to suggest this morning that if our motivation's in the right place and we're self-motivated, as the world would say, or Christ-motivated, as we might put it, then we become useful leaders. The truth is that employers face these challenges constantly when headhunting the right employees, don't they? I know that Tamara was on the team this morning, and this is part of her job, finding self-motivated people. Self-motivation in people allows them to pursue things that they are passionate about. If they are passionate about what you're doing, then you need to hire them. Simple as that, because they're going to do a great job. And it won't matter what they get paid, they're going to love it. Now, you should reward them, obviously, but this is a long way of saying, when you come to Jesus, don't be the kind of person that needs to have incentives for doing the right thing and punishments for doing the wrong thing. That's not going to be a fulfilled life. At the end of the day, we want to be the kinds of people that are so obsessed with Jesus that even the lowliest of tasks that we're assigned to in His name, we're going to take and do, and we're going to love it. I spent this week, I'm just going to share a little thing with you that'll probably enlighten you a tad. We don't have any cleaners at the moment at church, and we don't really need it because there's no one here. So there's not a lot to clean, but I'm doing the cleaning. I'm cleaning the toilets. I've got the brush in the toilet. I'm putting the bleach in. Everything's squeaky clean, so when you guys come back, they're going to be the best toilets in the world. And you know what? I haven't felt bad about it at all, because I'm not actually cleaning the toilets for you. I'm cleaning the toilets for Him. And that's the difference. That's what leadership's about. And so if we, in serving Jesus, have our eyes fixed firmly on Him, there's nothing that's below us. It's not a bad thing. I actually did it while I was singing. I was worshiping while I was cleaning. It was not such a bad thing at all. Guys, I want to suggest this morning that there's only one obsession that's acceptable to us, and that's the obsession to follow Jesus and do his works. It should be the one thing that we wake up for every single day, even in a COVID-19 world. The Apostle Paul's magnificent obsession in serving Jesus is clearly seen in the last part of this chapter, and let's have a look at it. From verse 19, he says, "Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible." Why would he possibly do that? Because he's not serving the people, he's serving the Lord. When you come to Jesus, my friends, he is the one and only person that goes at the top of the list as our master. Verse 20, "To the Jews I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law." Verse 21, "To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law." Very long-winded statement, but you've got to unpack it a bit. "So as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak, to win the weak. I've become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some." Why do you think he might want to do that? Because he's serving Jesus. That's the mission of Christ. You don't get paid. I've never been paid by the number of souls that I've led to the kingdom. Some months I'd go hungry if that were the case. Because this is a tough gig, trying to lead the world to Jesus. You and I both know that, don't we? We work with people that we've been praying for. We have family members that are outside the kingdom that we yearn to see come to Christ. It's a tough gig. Other times we might get a bonus. But thankfully we don't get paid by the number of souls that come to Jesus. It goes on in verse 26. "Therefore I do not run..." I think I missed verse 23, didn't I? Verse 23, he says, "I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last." So the second part of this book, or this chapter I should say, Paul explains the rant at the beginning. He's virtually saying, you can do it for that if you want, you can do it for the rewards. There are rights that you have, but if you do it for that and you get paid, that's it, you're paid. Or you can get the crown that lasts forever. Verse 26, "Therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it a slave, so that after I've preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified from the prize." Guys, that is the heart of the gospel message. This book is a wonderful book. 1 Corinthians, it's a tough book to read. Remember, it's written to a tough church that have come out of a world that was tough, that had idols, that had immorality of all kinds. And they came into this wonderful environment, and then they started to come to Jesus. And that's what church is about. It's meant to be a redemptive journey. Church is meant to be a place where people come in all shapes and sizes, with all kinds of backgrounds and motivations, and they all come with us towards our obsession, which is Jesus. You see, this is what a true calling to God looks like. It's about coming to him and having no other gods before him, being completely obsessed by being with him. Paul wasn't simply filling a spot on a roster, guys, though that's not a bad thing, it's a good thing of itself. He was totally blessed and obsessed with serving Jesus. Nothing else in life is going to satisfy him, and nothing else in life will satisfy you. So guys, wherever you are this morning, family, friends, those that are watching on, It's very revealing doing online church because people can come and there's no longer a door to knock on. It's like we live in a glass house and everybody's watching in, and that's perfectly fine with me. But wherever you are this morning, can I invite you to stand with me? And we're going to do some business with God. I'm going to ask the worship team to come back. And we're going to worship the Lord together and allow Him to minister to us. I really want us to get this thing. I think once we get this, it's going to unlock so much in our lives. Once we understand that just going through the motions in serving Jesus will never be good enough again. Once we get that, and once we come back to that first love, life will change. Life changes around this thing. It's no mistake, as I mentioned last week, that this chapter goes between the other two that talk about idols. Now, I mentioned last week that I felt there were people out there, and I'm looking at that little red light at the back of the room. There's probably even a couple in the room this morning. We went back to that point last week where there are people who are addicted to all sorts of different obsessions. And that's what they are. You see, an obsession fills a gap that's not being filled. This morning, I want to suggest that if Jesus truly becomes your magnificent obsession, you can't possibly hang on to the addictions that you had last week. It's as simple as that. And if we're still not at that place, then we're still not obsessed enough with Christ. That's my message this morning, guys. It's all about Him.